The quiet passenger. The rhythmic hum of the aircraft's engines seemed to match the steady beat of Amara Thompson's thoughts as she gazed out of the window. The vast, endless expanse of clouds beneath her, stretching far into the horizon, was both humbling and liberating. She always found solace in the skies. The world, in all its noise and clutter, faded away up here. The sprawling cityscapes, the rushing cars, the conversations that filled every corner of the earth, it all seemed so distant from this vantage point, high above the earth's surface. There was a particular kind of peace in being far from the ground, a quiet reprieve that allowed Amara to think clearly, reflect on her life, and, most importantly, escape from the world's unrelenting demands. To anyone observing her, she would seem like a typical business traveler. Her clothes were understated, a faded cardigan that had seen better days, dark trousers that were comfortable but not expensive, and a simple pair of black flats. She wasn't adorned with flashy jewelry or the visible trappings of wealth. But what few knew, what no one on this flight could guess, was that Amara was anything but typical. She was the wife of Charles Thompson, the billionaire founder and CEO of one of the largest and most influential airline corporations in the country. He had started the company with nothing but a vision, and now it was the backbone of global travel, one of the few airlines that held significant power in boardrooms, at government tables, and in the media. People knew Charles's name. They knew the family name that came with it. His face had graced the covers of magazines, and his name had appeared in headlines from every corner of the globe. And yet, few would ever recognize his wife. Amara had always preferred it that way. From the outside, it would be easy to look at her life and assume it was a fairy tale, wealth, luxury, a life of privilege beyond measure. Yet, in truth, there was a careful distance she kept from the spotlight. Amara had deliberately chosen to remain out of the public eye. Her decision wasn't born from any sense of shame, but from a deep-rooted desire for privacy. The media had always tried to catch glimpses of her, to get a picture or a quote, but she had learned how to navigate the world without drawing attention to herself. For years, she had worked hard to carve out an identity that wasn't overshadowed by the towering success of her husband. And in a world that so often defined people by their spouses, Amara had fought tirelessly for her own space, her own identity, and her own quiet life. She often preferred to be anonymous. It wasn't about hiding, it was about choosing the life she wanted without the constant pressure to conform to society's expectations of who she should be. Today, as the plane soared toward Miami, she found herself reflecting on how this choice to live simply, quietly, had come at a cost. She loved her husband, but their relationship had always been somewhat distant. Charles was always traveling, always in meetings, always tied up in business, leaving her to fill the silence with thoughts of what might have been. She had never minded the solitude, not really. It had become a part of who she was. But it also meant that her marriage was built on a foundation that was seldom shared in the traditional sense. They didn't have the luxuries of spontaneous moments, of leisurely dinners or lazy weekends. Their life was divided between airports, corporate boardrooms, and the occasional dinner gathering in one of their many lavish homes across the country. It wasn't the life she had imagined as a young woman, but it had become hers. The quiet moments, like this one on the plane, were where Amara found herself able to breathe. Her thoughts turned back to Charles. She had met him when she was younger, a college student with dreams of a simple life, not knowing how much her world would change. He had been charming, driven, and compelling, and the whirlwind romance had swept her off her feet. She had never intended to become the wife of a mogul. But when the opportunity to marry him came, she had found herself in a place where her love for him outweighed her reluctance to embrace the world that came with him. But here, above the clouds, she had the rare chance to feel like herself again, a woman without the weight of her husband's empire bearing down on her. She often thought about the life she could have led had she not married Charles. Would she have pursued a career in design, or opened a small bookstore in some quiet corner of the world? Would she have lived in a tiny apartment, surrounded by books, away from the world's expectations? Amara couldn't help but wonder. She had made her peace with the choices she had made, but she didn't always feel fully anchored in her life. A part of her longed for a simpler existence, one without the constant reminders of her role in the business world, one without the perfect dresses, the grand houses, the endless smiles and handshakes. The life of someone like herself, who was married to the most powerful man in the airline industry, was not a life that could ever truly be private. She could never walk through a crowded street without someone whispering behind her back. She could never attend an event without eyes following her every move. There was always a sense of being on display, even if she wasn't the one in the spotlight. The world, with its voracious need to label and categorize people, didn't understand the complexities of her choices. They saw her as the trophy wife of a powerful CEO. They never saw the quiet, introspective woman who found peace in a cardigan and a cup of tea. The soft voice of a flight attendant snapped her from her reverie. "Excuse me, ma'am, would you like something to drink?" Amara turned toward the young woman, giving her a polite smile. She had been so lost in her thoughts that she hadn't even realized the attendant had approached. "Just water, thank you," she replied, her voice soft but firm. The attendant nodded and moved on, and Amara's gaze drifted back to the window. She marveled at the vastness of the sky once again, the endless sea of clouds that stretched out before her, a reminder of how small and fleeting human concerns often seemed in the grand scheme of things. Here, up in the sky, none of the world's judgments mattered. But as the plane continued its journey, Amara couldn't shake the nagging feeling that her world was about to change. There was something in the air, an invisible shift she couldn't quite name. She had always been able to sense when things were about to take an unexpected turn. And today, on this flight, she could feel that something far beyond her quiet thoughts, was waiting for her on the other side of this journey. The unassuming attendant. Grace Bennett moved briskly down the aisle, her polished shoes clicking softly against the carpet of the plane, their sharp rhythm betraying the tension in her movements. She had been working the cabin for the past few hours, dealing with everything from an upset toddler who wouldn't stop crying to a demanding businessman who insisted on his seat being changed for the third time. Being a flight attendant on this particular airline wasn't always glamorous, but Grace had learned to deal with it all. It wasn't the passengers she minded, most of them were harmless, even if some were a bit demanding. It was the constant pressure to be perfect. Her uniform was crisp and meticulously put together, every detail reflecting her professionalism. But despite her neat appearance, there was something in the way she carried herself that suggested she was always on guard, always ready for the next challenge. After 6 years of serving in the skies, Grace had developed a sharpness to her tone, a certain coldness in her eyes, that came from dealing with one too many entitled passengers. She had seen it all, people who treated her like a servant, who expected her to cater to their every whim as if she were invisible. And so, over the years, she had built up walls to protect herself, never showing more than what was necessary. As she walked down the aisle, she scanned the passengers with practiced efficiency. She made brief eye contact here and there, offering a tight smile, but she never lingered long enough to engage in small talk. She had learned long ago that keeping her interactions short and impersonal was the key to surviving long shifts. She kept moving, offering drinks, passing out snacks, and doing her job without much thought. She didn't particularly enjoy her work, but it paid the bills. And for Grace, that was enough. She had a quiet sense of superiority in the way she carried herself. She worked hard, and she had been promoted to a senior attendant position after years of proving herself. She was a no-nonsense kind of person. Grace didn't care much for the drama that sometimes came with her job. She had seen enough in her years of service to know that there was a fine line between kindness and allowing people to take advantage of her. So, she kept her guard up, kept her distance from the passengers, and carried out her duties with precision. When she reached Amara's row, her eyes flicked over the woman seated by the window, but only for a brief second. She had seen people like Amara before, quiet, unassuming. Nothing about her stood out. She looked like she belonged to that particular group of passengers who didn't demand attention or special treatment. The kind of passenger that didn't make waves. Grace had never been one to judge appearances too harshly, but she couldn't help but notice how out of place Amara seemed in her current surroundings. The simplicity of her attire, a worn cardigan and basic black pants, struck Grace as odd. Most of the passengers she served were dressed in crisp suits, expensive blouses, or designer dresses. This woman, however, seemed different. Too modest. It piqued her curiosity for a fleeting moment. Still, Grace quickly dismissed the thought. She had a job to do, and time was ticking. "Ma'am," Grace said, her voice flat and professional, as she stepped into the aisle next to Amara's seat. "Can I get you something to drink?" Her tone was polite but businesslike, as if she had already decided the conversation was going to be brief. It wasn't that she had anything against the woman, it was just easier to be polite without getting involved. In Grace's experience, passengers rarely had the same calm demeanor that Amara exhibited. Most of them either wanted to complain about something or needed assistance beyond what Grace could offer. Her tone had been crafted over the years to avoid any unnecessary emotional exchanges. Amara, still lost in the rhythm of the flight and the thoughts she had been mulling over, looked up slowly. She smiled faintly, her voice gentle and calm. "Just water, thank you." Grace nodded, her lips curving into a tight smile, and then she moved on, the encounter already fading into the background of her day. It was a simple exchange, just another drink request in a sea of them. But as Grace moved down the aisle, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this woman, about this moment, was different. Despite herself, she glanced over her shoulder once, watching Amara's serene profile as she resumed looking out of the window. The stillness of her presence felt almost out of place in the busy, bustling cabin of the plane, a stark contrast to the loud, impatient energy that often filled the air on flights. Most passengers were engrossed in their phones, chatting loudly, or fiddling with entertainment options. But not Amara. She was quiet. So quiet that it almost felt like she wasn't part of the world around her. Grace shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. She had too much to do to get caught up in passenger profiles. She moved on, focusing on the next task ahead, but something in the back of her mind nagged at her. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was something magnetic about Amara, something that tugged at her curiosity, though Grace didn't quite know why. As the hours passed, Grace found herself revisiting the encounter more than she would have liked to admit. She couldn't help it. There was something in the way Amara sat, the way she carried herself, that made her feel exposed, somehow. The woman exuded a quiet strength, but it wasn't the kind of strength that demanded attention. It was subtle, woven into the fabric of her being. Grace wasn't accustomed to people like that. Most of the time, her interactions were with passengers who were loud and assertive, or those who expected to be waited on like royalty. But Amara was different. Later, as Grace passed by Amara's row once again, she noticed that the woman was still lost in her thoughts, her gaze fixed out the window. The quietness around her seemed to envelop her, creating an invisible boundary that made Grace hesitate for a moment. She found herself wondering, who was this woman really? With a sigh, Grace quickly moved on, focusing on her tasks. But the nagging curiosity didn't leave her. There was something unsettling about how effortlessly Amara seemed to exist in this space, how untouched by the chaos and noise of the world around her. By the time Grace made her final rounds before the plane began its descent, her thoughts returned to Amara. She had heard quiet whispers among the staff about a high-profile passenger on board, someone important enough that the captain had made a special announcement earlier in the flight. But who could it be? There were several well-dressed passengers, but none that had drawn the attention of the crew. Grace pushed the thought aside. She had a job to do. Still, something told her that this wasn't the last time she'd find herself wondering about the woman in seat 13A. The unspoken connection. The plane's descent began smoothly, and the steady hum of the engine softened, replaced by the gentle vibrations of the aircraft adjusting to its lower altitude. As the flight attendants began preparing the cabin for landing, there was a noticeable change in the atmosphere. Passengers shifted in their seats, some strapping on seat belts, others grabbing their belongings from the overhead bins. The usual pre-landing hustle was underway, but this time, for some reason, Grace felt out of sync with it all. She moved with practiced efficiency down the aisles, securing seatbelts, checking overhead compartments, and ensuring every passenger was ready for the descent. Yet, despite the controlled movements, her mind was somewhere else. She found herself unconsciously scanning the rows again, her eyes briefly flitting over Amara's seat. The woman still sat with that quiet stillness, looking out the window as if the world beyond the glass held all the answers to the questions Grace couldn't quite place. It was strange, really. She had encountered hundreds of passengers during her years in the sky, yet few had held her attention like this. And it wasn't just that Amara exuded an air of calmness, there was something deeper at play. Something about the way she carried herself, the unspoken confidence she radiated, felt almost magnetic. As the plane began its final approach, Grace found herself closer to Amara than before, just a few steps away. It was then that she noticed something she hadn't before: there was no one else sitting beside the woman. A small detail, really, but it struck Grace. Most people traveling alone seem to fill the empty space with their restlessness, their desire to stay engaged with something, anything, whether it be a book, a tablet, or a conversation. But not Amara. She was a quiet island of composure in the middle of a bustling plane. For a fleeting moment, Grace hesitated. There was a strange pull to speak to the woman, to engage in some form of casual conversation. But the moment passed as quickly as it had come. The plane's final descent brought her focus back to the task at hand, and she moved further down the aisle, preparing for the landing announcements. Yet, as she made her way toward the front of the cabin, Grace caught something in her peripheral vision. A man. Tall, with broad shoulders and a commanding presence, he had entered the cabin with an air of quiet authority. Grace didn't know who he was, but the passengers sitting near him instinctively stood a little straighter, their gazes darting toward him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. There was something about his demeanor that made him seem out of place on a commercial flight. He didn't belong in the casual, relaxed atmosphere of the cabin. Before she could process the thought, the man made his way down the aisle and stopped right at Amara's row. Grace watched, unable to stop herself. The man leaned down slightly, and as he spoke, Grace caught snippets of the conversation. "I'm glad to see you're doing well," he said softly, a hint of warmth in his voice. Amara turned, her eyes lighting up just for a second before she composed herself again. "Thank you, Charles. It's been a smooth flight." The name sent a jolt through Grace. Charles. The name seemed familiar, though she couldn't place it. She continued to watch from a distance, her professional demeanor starting to crack just a little. She had overheard whispers before about a high-profile passenger on board, someone important. But it was just a rumor, one she had dismissed in favor of focusing on the work at hand. Now, watching the exchange between Amara and this man, Grace felt her curiosity reach a peak. Charles. She had heard the name before, no doubt. But where? She had worked in the airline industry long enough to recognize the names of powerful individuals who frequented the company's flights. This was no ordinary businessman. This was someone with a significant presence, someone whose name likely carried weight in the media and boardrooms. The realization hit her like a sudden gust of wind. Amara wasn't just some unassuming passenger. The woman seated in row 13A was married to this man. Charles Thompson. The owner of one of the largest airline conglomerates in the country. The name alone sent ripples through Grace's thoughts, though she had little time to dwell on it. She could feel the subtle shift in the air now, the way the energy in the cabin seemed to change just with the presence of the man. The respect, the reverence, it was palpable. And yet, despite the attention that the man drew, Amara remained the picture of calmness, almost unaffected by the sudden change in her surroundings. There was something about her composure that struck Grace deeply, something that made her wonder if the quiet woman had always known her own worth, long before anyone else recognized it. "Are we almost there?" Amara asked, her voice still soft, her gaze returning to the window, as if the conversation had already ended. Charles didn't seem surprised. He simply gave her a gentle smile. "Yes, just a few more minutes. It won't be long now." With that, he nodded politely to Grace, who stood nearby, unsure of what to do with herself. She had been observing something deeply personal, something that felt far beyond the limits of her role. And yet, she couldn't look away. The connection between them, the way they interacted so effortlessly, it was clear that they had shared a long history, a partnership far more intricate than what Grace had originally assumed. As Charles moved toward the front of the plane, Grace found herself standing in a daze. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the image that was emerging was far more complicated than she had anticipated. Charles Thompson, the man who owned half the world's major airlines, had just spoken casually to a woman who, until now, had seemed so utterly unremarkable to Grace. It was as if she had seen the world through a very different lens, one that had nothing to do with wealth or status. It struck Grace that Amara might have lived in the shadow of her husband's immense success for years, yet she carried herself without any of the pretensions that so often came with power and wealth. For the first time that day, Grace felt the weight of the woman's presence in a new way. This wasn't just another quiet passenger. Amara Thompson wasn't just the wife of someone important. She was someone entirely on her own, a force that had been invisible to those around her, hidden beneath layers of simplicity and calm. As the plane touched down in Miami and the final preparations for landing began, Grace found herself struggling to focus. The realization was sinking in: she had just served someone whose life was far more complicated, far more intertwined with the world than she could have ever imagined. And now, the simple drink request, the brief conversation, all felt like a distant memory, replaced by the quiet weight of understanding. The moment had passed, but Grace knew one thing for certain now: things were not always what they seemed. And as the flight attendants ushered the passengers to the gates, she wondered what kind of world Amara Thompson really inhabited, one that no one could ever fully see. The unseen power. The plane had landed smoothly, the steady rumble of the wheels on the tarmac slowly fading into silence. The bustling hum of the cabin that had filled the air during the flight now gave way to the chaotic energy of passengers preparing to disembark. Grace was on autopilot, every movement measured, every step automatic as she made her way down the aisle, helping passengers with their overhead luggage and guiding them toward the exits. But her mind was still on Amara. Amara Thompson. The name carried more weight now, more significance than it had a few hours ago. The woman who had seemed so ordinary to Grace during the flight had, in reality, been a silent force all along. Grace had spent years in the airline industry, serving dignitaries and wealthy elites, but never had she encountered someone like Amara, someone whose calm and composure seemed to defy the expectations that the world had placed upon her. As passengers filtered out of the plane, Grace's eyes kept returning to Amara, who was still seated, waiting for the crowd to thin. She sat in the same quiet way, her gaze not focused on anyone in particular but on something unseen, something distant. For a moment, Grace found herself studying the woman with the same intensity she had previously reserved for VIPs or celebrities, only to realize that Amara was nothing like those people. She wasn't seeking attention, nor was she flaunting her wealth or status. She was simply there, as if the world around her was of no consequence. Grace tried to shake off the lingering thoughts, focusing instead on the practicalities of her job. But as the last few passengers filed out, she found herself standing still, staring at Amara and wondering how it was that such a powerful woman could make such little impact on the outside world. It was as if Amara existed in a bubble of her own creation, untouched, untainted, and yet undeniably influential. The more Grace thought about it, the more she realized that her initial judgments about the woman had been entirely wrong. She had assumed that Amara was just another quiet, reserved passenger, blending in with the rest. But now, knowing who she was, Grace understood that she had missed something crucial. The woman who sat in 13A wasn't merely a passenger. She was a part of a world that Grace could only glimpse from the outside. As Grace made her way to the front of the plane, she could feel the weight of the realization settling in. She had no idea what kind of relationship Amara had with Charles Thompson, but she was beginning to suspect that it was far more complicated than just being his wife. There was something about their brief exchange, the subtle yet unmistakable connection between them, that hinted at a deeper, more intricate story, one that Grace had yet to fully understand. But just as she was about to make her way toward the cockpit to prepare for her next round of duties, she heard a soft voice calling her name. Grace. She turned to see Amara standing just a few steps away, her presence still calm, still composed. The way the woman moved, the way she carried herself, it was as if she had a different rhythm than everyone else. For a second, Grace wondered if she had been mistaken, if perhaps she had imagined the whole thing, but then Amara spoke again. I wanted to thank you for your service today, Amara said, her voice warm but measured, the words perfectly chosen. She offered a soft smile, but it was not one that demanded anything in return. It was simply an acknowledgement, a gesture of quiet grace. Grace stood frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to catch up with the situation. It's my pleasure, Miss Thompson, she replied, her voice instinctively respectful, though she wasn't sure why. Amara had not introduced herself as the wife of Charles Thompson, but there was no mistaking the name that had drifted through the cabin when Charles had approached her earlier. It was as if something unspoken passed between them, a realization that neither of them needed to voice out loud. Amara tilted her head slightly, her eyes glancing over Grace in a way that felt both direct and observant, as if she were seeing something beyond the surface. Please, Amara continued, her tone still soft but with an underlying strength, just call me Amara. For a split second, Grace felt an odd sensation. Like she was being invited into a world that she had no right to enter. She could sense that Amara's life was filled with complexities that most people would never understand, complexities that had nothing to do with wealth or status. There was a quiet power in the way she spoke, in the way she moved, and Grace found herself uncertain of how to respond. Of course. Amara, Grace replied, her voice barely above a whisper, unsure of what else to say. Amara's smile remained steady, unfazed. I know this must all seem a little strange to you, she said, her voice almost as if she had read Grace's mind. But I appreciate your professionalism. It's rare to find that in someone these days. Grace blinked, a little caught off guard by the words. She had expected something different, perhaps a more formal exchange, or even some kind of cold dismissal. But Amara's words were genuine, sincere, and it struck Grace more than she cared to admit. In a world where people with money and power often expected special treatment or deference, Amara was different. She didn't ask for respect, she simply commanded it. Before Grace could respond, Amara turned and began to walk toward the door of the plane, her steps purposeful, yet still carrying that same quiet elegance. Grace watched her leave, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions, none of which seemed to have easy answers. But as the last few passengers exited the plane and the crew began their final checks, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just in her perception of Amara, but in herself. There was a subtle but undeniable change in the air, a feeling that the boundaries between her world and Amara's had blurred, and that the encounter had somehow altered the course of her day in ways she couldn't quite explain. For the first time, Grace found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about the people she served. And as she prepared to leave the plane, she realized that this was just the beginning of something far more complex than she had ever anticipated. The weight of secrets. The days following the flight were a blur for Grace. The encounter with Amara lingered in her thoughts longer than she cared to admit. It wasn't that she couldn't shake the memory of the beautiful, quiet woman who had barely spoken to her. It wasn't even the small moments of connection between them that played on her mind. No, it was something deeper, a feeling that there was more to Amara than met the eye. Something about their brief exchange made Grace feel as though she had touched the surface of a vast ocean, and in that instant, she knew that there were hidden depths beneath it. Back in the crew quarters, Grace tried to focus on the mundane tasks of preparing for the next flight, but it was hard to concentrate. Her mind kept returning to the briefest moments of her interaction with Amara, replaying the soft words of gratitude, the way Amara carried herself with such quiet dignity, and how she had never once seemed to seek anything from Grace or the other crew members. It was a sharp contrast to the way many passengers, especially those of wealth and influence, tended to behave, expecting special treatment, often in ways that bordered on demanding. Amara had been different. She was almost invisible, in a sense. But in the most compelling way. At times, Grace wondered if Amara had known how much she had affected her. The soft-spoken words, the silent yet perceptive way Amara observed her, all felt as if they had been chosen with deliberate care. Had Amara seen through her? Had she recognized something in Grace that no one else had? The questions consumed Grace in ways she couldn't explain. And then there was Charles, Amara's husband, who seemed to exist as a distant shadow in her mind. She hadn't known who he was until that moment on the plane, but now his name kept resurfacing in her thoughts. Charles Thompson. The owner of one of the largest and most powerful airlines in the country. Grace had met many people during her years as a flight attendant, actors, politicians, business tycoons, but no one like Charles. There was an aura about him, a power that extended far beyond his physical presence. And yet, as she remembered him on the plane, she realized there was something about him that made him different, too. The way he had spoken to Amara, so effortlessly, with the kind of warmth and familiarity that suggested they shared more than just a marriage. It was clear from their brief exchange that their relationship was far deeper than it appeared on the surface. But just as quickly as the thought crossed Grace's mind, she pushed it aside. It wasn't her place to speculate. She was a flight attendant, and her role was to serve, not to pry into the lives of the passengers. But then, in the days that followed, Grace received an unexpected call from her supervisor. Grace, the voice on the other end of the line was urgent, clipped. "We need you to prepare for a special assignment." Special assignment? Grace repeated, her mind instantly going on alert. She had worked many flights, had dealt with VIPs, but a special assignment was something entirely different. Yes, the supervisor confirmed. Charles Thompson is traveling with his wife on a private charter flight. It's a high-priority trip, and we need you to be part of the crew. You'll be serving as the lead flight attendant. It's important, Grace. There's no room for error. Grace felt a sharp pang of disbelief, mixed with something else, nervous excitement, perhaps. She hadn't expected this, not at all. She hadn't even considered the possibility of working on a flight with Charles and Amara, but now it seemed inevitable. She was being pulled into their world in ways she hadn't planned for. Understood, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. When is the flight? Tomorrow morning. Be at the hangar early. And, Grace, the supervisor's voice dropped, becoming almost conspiratorial, this is a big opportunity for you. Don't blow it. The line went dead before Grace could ask anything else. She stood there for a moment, processing the weight of the conversation. This wasn't just another flight. This was something bigger. And the fact that Amara and Charles would be on board only made it feel more significant. The next morning, Grace arrived at the hangar early, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and nerves. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew this could change everything. As she walked through the hangar's large, echoing space, the sleek private jet sat in the center like a silent sentinel, waiting for its passengers. The crew was already bustling around, preparing everything for the flight. Grace, however, couldn't help but feel like an outsider. This wasn't her usual environment. There was a palpable air of exclusivity here, and every movement felt more deliberate, more controlled. As the crew began boarding, she saw him, Charles Thompson, standing near the plane's entrance, speaking with a couple of business associates. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his every movement exuding power and confidence. Yet, for all his imposing presence, there was a calm about him, an almost unnerving ability to remain composed in any situation. Amara was beside him, her presence just as striking, though in a completely different way. She wasn't in the tailored suit that many would expect of someone of her status. Instead, she wore a simple, flowing dress, elegant in its simplicity. It was almost as if she was trying to blend in, to keep herself hidden from the world that so often clamored for attention. But even with her understated appearance, there was no mistaking the quiet authority that emanated from her. Grace's breath caught in her throat when she saw her again. For the briefest moment, their eyes met, and there was a flicker of something, a recognition, perhaps, but it was gone in an instant. Amara's gaze shifted back to Charles, her expression unreadable. It was almost as if the connection between them was something far deeper than Grace could ever understand. She quickly composed herself, walking briskly over to where the rest of the crew was preparing. As she approached, she couldn't help but overhear fragments of the conversation between Charles and Amara. "Everything is set," Charles was saying, his voice low but filled with authority. "This is the right move, Amara. I promise you." Amara's response was soft, too soft for Grace to catch the exact words. But she could hear the subtle tension in her tone. "I trust you, Charles," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. "But you need to understand what this means." Grace felt her pulse quicken. There was something heavy in Amara's voice, a weight that suggested more was at stake than what appeared on the surface. She was no longer just a silent passenger in Grace's world. She was a player in a much larger game, one that Grace was only beginning to realize. The realization was slow to sink in, but it hit her with undeniable force. This flight was more than just a journey. It was a turning point. As the final preparations were made, Grace felt the tension in the air grow thicker. She wasn't just flying them to a destination, she was about to become part of a story that was far bigger than anything she had ever encountered. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for what was to come. The storm brews. The plane was in the air before Grace had fully processed the shift in her role. She had been on countless flights, but none of them had felt like this. The atmosphere aboard the private jet was thick with unspoken words, with an energy that crackled between the passengers and crew, a weight that pressed against her chest every time she moved through the cabin. Grace stood by her post at the front of the plane, doing her best to maintain a professional demeanor. But there was no denying the swirling tension that had been building ever since they had taken off. It wasn't just the stark difference between this flight and the usual commercial ones she worked. It wasn't just the fact that Charles and Amara were on board, or the whispers of high-stakes business deals being discussed in hushed tones between Charles and his associates. It was something else entirely, the undercurrent of a story that was slowly unfolding, and Grace was caught in the middle of it. She tried to focus on the task at hand. The drinks were served, the snacks distributed. She smiled politely as she moved through the cabin, but the whole time, her thoughts were elsewhere. Her eyes kept darting to Amara, who sat at the opposite end of the cabin, her face as composed as ever. There was something in the way she held herself, something almost imperceptible, that told Grace she was a woman carrying far more than the weight of a marriage or a business partnership. Amara Thompson was not just a passenger on this flight. She was a force, a presence that demanded attention without ever asking for it. The quiet hum of the plane's engines filled the space between them, but as the hours passed, it became clear that the silence was anything but comfortable. It was heavy, laden with anticipation. Grace could feel the distance between herself and the others like a thick veil, one that she was desperately trying to lift. At one point, Charles leaned toward Amara, his voice low but urgent. Their conversation was almost inaudible, but the few words that Grace caught were enough to make her stomach tighten. The tone in Charles's voice was one of command, but it was also tinged with something else, something that bordered on desperation. And Amara's response, though quiet, was firm. "I'm not going to be part of this, Charles," she said, her voice steady but laced with an unyielding resolve. "You're making a mistake, and you know it." Grace froze, her heart racing. She had been trained not to eavesdrop, to maintain boundaries with the passengers. But this was different. The way Charles had spoken to Amara, the way she had responded, there was something undeniably personal about it. This was no longer just about business. It was about something much deeper, something that Grace could not fully understand, but could feel in the air around her. Before Grace could process what she had overheard, Amara stood up and walked toward the rear of the plane, her movements graceful but purposeful. Charles watched her go, a flicker of something crossing his face. Grace couldn't tell if it was anger, frustration, or something else, but there was no mistaking the tension between them. It was palpable, like a storm on the horizon, waiting to break. The rest of the flight passed in an uneasy silence. Charles and his associate seemed to withdraw into their own world, leaving Amara to her thoughts. She sat near the back of the plane, her gaze fixed out of the small window, lost in the view of the clouds below. Grace could see that her thoughts were far away, her posture relaxed but with a quiet sadness that seemed to radiate from her. There was a kind of vulnerability in her silence, one that Grace had not expected. This was not the strong, composed woman she had seen earlier. This was someone who was grappling with something, someone who had been forced into a position where her own emotions no longer belonged to her. It wasn't until the plane reached cruising altitude that Grace was asked to join Charles and Amara in the private section at the front of the cabin. She felt a twinge of nerves run through her as she approached them, but she pushed it aside. This was her job, after all. She was here to serve, and nothing more. "Grace, please join us," Charles said, his voice calm but with an undertone of something else, something that felt almost like an invitation. "We need to discuss the plans for the upcoming meetings." Grace nodded, trying to keep her composure intact. She moved toward them, taking a seat in the empty chair beside Amara. She could feel the eyes of both Charles and Amara on her as she settled in, and for the first time in a long while, she felt completely out of her depth. It was as though the very air in this part of the plane was charged with tension, and she was standing on the edge of something volatile, something that could explode at any moment. "So, Grace," Charles began, his voice warm but calculating, "I wanted to get your opinion on a few things. As you know, we've been having some issues with the upcoming merger. There are a few obstacles that we need to overcome before we can finalize the deal." Grace nodded, her mind racing to keep up with the conversation. "Of course, Mr. Thompson. I'll do my best to assist in any way I can." But it was Amara who spoke next, her voice soft yet unyielding. "There are no obstacles, Charles. There are simply choices. And we both know that this isn't the right one." Grace's heart skipped a beat. The words hung in the air like a challenge, one that neither Charles nor Grace seemed prepared for. It was as if Amara was speaking not just about the business deal, but about something far more personal, a decision that involved more than just numbers and boardrooms. It was about trust, about power, about the very foundation of their relationship. Charles remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on his wife. Grace could feel the intensity of the moment, the weight of the unspoken words that passed between them. Then, Charles leaned back in his seat, his expression hardening. "We don't have time for second-guessing, Amara," he said, his voice clipped. "The world isn't waiting for us to make up our minds. If you want to play the waiting game, that's your choice. But I'm moving forward." There was a sharp, almost electric silence that followed, and for a moment, Grace felt like she was suffocating. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to break the tension, but she couldn't find the words. Everything she might have said felt insignificant in the face of the storm that was brewing between them. Amara's response was a long time coming, but when it came, it was as quiet and deliberate as everything else about her. "Then I guess it's time for us to stop playing, Charles. For both our sakes." The words hit like a thunderclap, the sound reverberating through Grace's chest. She could feel the weight of the moment settle between them, and in the silence that followed, she realized that this flight was no longer just about business. It was about something far deeper, far more personal. It was about a reckoning, a moment where the choices they made would define the course of everything that followed. And in that moment, Grace knew that she was no longer just a spectator. She had become part of the story. A story that was unfolding in real time, and one that would change everything.